start.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how we can use contextualized word embeddings to analyze human language processing, specifically in the cases of polysemes and homonyms. Oops. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to answer the question, what are homonyms and polysemes? These are both kinds of lexical ambiguities where a word has a single spelling but multiple meanings. In the case of polysemy, the meanings are related and referred to as senses. So the word paper, for example, has a meaning like a sheet that you write something on, but it could also mean something that you read to get the news. The referent in these two cases is different, but they're similar and share some semantic core between them. So in this case, we would say that paper is polysemous and has multiple related senses. Homonyms, on the other hand, have meanings that are unrelated. So bark, for example, can mean the sound a dog makes, or it can mean the outer covering of a tree. These two meanings aren't related to each other at all, so bark is a homonym. Typically, the way that these two can be distinguished in a dictionary is by their organization. Word meanings correspond to dictionary headings, while senses are the entries beneath a heading. So now you might be wondering if there are different kinds of ambiguities, does that matter in how we process language? And unfortunately, there isn't really a straightforward answer to that. Many psycholinguistic experiments have found that being polysemous or having multiple related senses can make a word easier to recognize. This has been observed in lexical decision experiments where participants are asked to indicate whether or not they recognize a word after they see it flash on a screen. And then faster recognition times of polysemous words over unambiguous words are assumed to correspond to easier processing of the polysemous words. Experiments have had less consistent results with homonyms. Some studies find that having multiple unrelated meanings can actually slow the reaction time, or they don't find an effect of meanings at all. So further work needs to be done to truly understand the effect of unrelated meanings on word recognition. However, one challenge to researching this is that there isn't really a gold standard resource that can be used to quantify homonymy and polysemy. Typically, resources like dictionaries or WordNet are used, but there are limitations to using these like human curated resources. Additionally, studies are inconsistent about which resources are being used or what distinctions are made between homophony and polysemy. One study might use one dictionary while another study uses WordNet, and there's no guarantees that those resources are making the same distinctions. So this makes it difficult to establish replicable effects across experiments. So because of these limitations, we would like to find some way to quantify homophony and polysemy that is not reliant on resources created by lexicographers and has a clear criteria as to what distinguishes a related sense from an unrelated meaning. So the one way that we propose this can be done is by using contextualized word embeddings. Unlike static word embeddings, contextualized word embeddings have representations that vary depending on the words and the surrounding context. This means that for an ambiguous word, there are likely to be multiple distinct embeddings corresponding to usages in different contexts. So our aims in this study are first to propose a way to utilize this in order to quantify homonymy and polysemy, and then test this measure's ability to predict human behavior in comparison to the more traditional measures that have been used. So the first step to using contextualized embeddings to quantify the number of senses a word has is, of course, collecting the contextualized embeddings from a number of different contexts. So to do this, we sampled 1,000 occurrences of each word from English Wikipedia and included their context sentences with that. Then we used BERT to produce embeddings for each of the sampled sentences, and then just extracted the embedding corresponding to the word of interest. This singular embedding was used for all further analysis, and the rest of the sentence embeddings were just discarded. Once we had the embeddings, we reduced their dimensions from 758 to 2. With fewer dimensions, we're able to visualize the embeddings in space, as can be seen in this figure here for the word tent. And as you can see in the figure, we're already able to see the emergence of a couple different groupings in space, which are corresponding to groups of embeddings that are more internally similar to each other and dissimilar from the other groups. So because there's a clear clustering that we're already seeing emerging, we're able to apply a clustering algorithm to count the number of clusters or senses that exist in this vector space. So the clustering algorithm that we use is HDB scan. This works for our purposes for two reasons. First, the number of clusters does not need to be specified a priori, which is useful because the whole purpose of this is to discover the number of clusters. So we don't want it to be a parameter that we have at the beginning. And then secondly, it can identify points as noise in addition to assigning them to cluster membership. Because language is very flexible, we want to leave open the possibility that not every time a word appears, it's a new sense or a new meaning. Sometimes it's just a creative use of that word that is fine in that context, but is not applicable to everybody's understanding of that word. So we want to leave open the possibility that not necessarily every usage belongs to a specific meaning or a specific sense cluster. After the clustering procedure, which you can see here represented by the individual shapes, we have 3 clusters that appeared. We can inspect the original sentences that correspond to the individual points in the clusters to get an idea for what that cluster represents. So in this figure, we can see that the largest cluster corresponds to the most obvious sense of the word tent, perhaps, which is like a structure that might shield you from the elements. And there's a smaller cluster to the lower right of that, which corresponds to a more metaphorical usage of the word tent, where there isn't a literal structure, but still like a large grouping of people that are gathering. And finally, there's a cluster that's farther to the left of the rest of them that corresponds to the proper noun usages of tent. So when something is like called the tent or has a title. So as you can see by this example, by inspecting the number of clusters, we can get a good idea of how many senses a word has. This means that we can directly use the number of clusters as the number of senses to quantify polysemy. And we can use a similar procedure for identifying the number of meanings a word has, because as analogous to how a sense is defined as a set of related usages, a meaning can be defined as a set of related senses. So in order to get a different meaning clustering, we must first use a different set of points from the one used for sense clustering. Obviously, so we don't get the identical clustering, we need a separate clustering for meanings. So we use the HDB scan to identify a set of exemplar points from our original sense clusters. Exemplar points are those which persist longest as cluster members during the hierarchical clustering procedures, and loosely, they're most centrally located and best representative of a cluster. So in the figure at the right, you can see the exemplar points that are identified by the algorithm are the ones that are larger, and they do appear more centrally, less to the outside of clusters. And then once the exemplar points have been identified, we can apply the same clustering algorithm again, just to those points, the exemplar points, to identify any structure amongst those clusters themselves. So in the figure to the right, we can see that doing this second clustering has joined the structure tent usage with the metaphorical usage into a single meaning and identify the proper noun usages as noise that are not a separate meaning or the same meaning as the first meaning identified. So exactly like the senses, we can use the number of clusters that are identified in this higher order clustering procedure to be the number of meanings, because it's the clustering of senses or of sense clusters loosely. So now that we've identified a method to quantify ambiguities using our contextualized word embeddings, we can move on to comparing our measures with those traditionally used in the prediction of human word recognition. So to do this, we compared our measures used with those in an early experiment by Jennifer Rod and colleagues. Their stimuli set contained 124 ambiguous words and 58 unambiguous words. And in their results, they report a facilitatory effect for number of senses and an inhibitory effect for number of meanings. And we replicate their experiment using our measures and the reaction times and other control variables from the English Lexicon Project. So at the top here, you can see the full model that we tested for predicting reaction time. It included a variable for the number of senses and the number of meanings, as well as control variables such as log word frequency, length, neighborhood, and concreteness. In the figure on the left, you can see a subset of the coefficients for the senses as well as the control variables. The number of senses as derived from the contextual word embeddings does significantly predict the reaction time, and the effect is facilitatory, as can be seen in the figure on the right. This replicates the original finding that was reported by Rod. However, when we tried to replicate their own experiment using the number of senses from WordNet, we did not find a significant reaction or a significant effect, despite this being reported in the original experiment. And then we also see a similar pattern for the number of meanings. The number of meanings as derived from the contextualized embeddings significantly predicts the reaction time, and it's inhibitory, meaning that having more meanings slows down your reaction time. This was, again, the same result that Rod reported in their original study. However, when we tried to replicate their findings using their own variables, we found the opposite result, where meanings were facilitatory. So we don't really have an explanation for why the original results, when we tried to replicate them using the variables that the original authors used, didn't replicate, but our derived variables follow the reported patterns. So that's what we're interested in for now in this experiment. So that was a lot, but just overall, we showed that we've shown how contextualized word embeddings can contain information about homonymy and polysemy, and how that information can be used for the study of human language processing. We think that future work can continue to use this methodology while also investigating how to optimize it further and comparing it to additional measures of ambiguity. So thank you so much for your attention, and I can now take any questions.